Hi there, coming to you from the Heinz Broadcast Studios in the home office here. This is going to be Unit 9, Teaching Methods and Strategies, Chapters 14 and 15 in your textbook if you're following along. There, let's get to some teaching methods. Major teaching approaches that we're going to cover in the first one is the subject matter and direction instruction, or direct instruction. Basically what we're doing as an instructor or a leader, a manager, is using instructional objectives to frame the lesson. Basically what you're doing is dropping an anchor or a baseline for all teaching, and then all learning activities layer on top of that. So all the essential topics are going to be covered one by one, and then the activities are developed with the learner's characteristics in mind so that you can reinforce the things that you've talked about. You might use discussions, you may use case studies, some more traditional assessment, quizzes or tests or projects might come into here as well. But generally this is more of a lecture discussion based type approach. And that leads us into the next kind of interlying method in here, which is simple direct instruction. And this is a real teacher-centered, or what we call authoritative type teaching strategy, where it combines the explanation, think lecture, with student practice and feedback. Basically think of this as a teacher walks into a classroom, delivers all the content via personal lecture. You as a student or an audience member of some kind takes notes and then has to do some kind of activity to prove to the instructor that they comprehended the material that was presented, whether it's a guided practice, independent practice, things of that nature. And of course, if you look over the educational history, especially the last 30 years, there's a lot of research that supports this. It's very effective whenever learners need structure. Many of you are very comfortable with this method because that's what you're used to. It's the most common method of instruction through and through at all levels. And whenever instructors deviate from this method, it tends to make students uncomfortable with what's going to occur, and they lack confidence into how to embrace their own learning at times, and so it makes them not particularly like certain approaches to learning. But that's the most common approach. Next one is what we call personalized instruction, where the concept here is all learners can master any topic if you give them enough time. So this accounts for varying rates of student learning. Some learners are going to learn at a very quick pace, and they're going to be able to capture the concepts very quickly, and some are going to take a little bit more time in order to master the concepts that you're presenting to them. So it's very self-paced. Basically, the teacher now transforms from an authoritarian figure like in lecture delivery to now more of a facilitator. Whether you're just presenting supplemental material to help them. The textbook, instead of the baseline for all instruction, now becomes a learning resource. And you may just proctor activities as far as that goes. I've used this at times, and especially when we talk about online delivery. You can do very personalized instruction. And you can have students that are in a much different place in the learning map or in the unit map. So there's a lot of different advantages here, and Ag Ed many times is well suited to this because of the lab-based things that we try and accomplish and integrate into our teaching. We can also think of this as competency-based education, where we're trying to teach psychomotor skills, for example, like the ability to do certain things, build a shed for the yard, amongst a group of students in your shop class. Maybe following lab procedures specifically. When we're talking about a dissection, maybe certain performance elements. So competency-based education comes into this personalized approach. Approach outcomes, typically, you'll probably have increased learning and increased retention, which is really what you're after. Many students report that they really like this approach because it allows them to do whatever they need to do at the pace that they need to do it. But from an instructor's point of view, this is pretty difficult to manage. And I've had experience with this. Again, like I alluded to, I'll have students in some online courses that they'll get way ahead of everybody. They dedicate themselves to their work. They'll complete things well ahead of schedule and complete sometimes eventually the class way ahead of everybody else. And then, of course, I have folks on the other end of the spectrum that I'm helping trying to help catch up all the time, and they're always behind, and they struggle maybe to grasp certain concepts. And so you can have students all over the map in terms of where they are in the course. The next one is problem-based or inductive style learning. And so think of this as inquiry-based, problem-solving, and especially the hot one is experiential learning, where basically we're trying to encourage students to think more critically and more deeply into the problems as they are presented. Trying to get a student more engaged in the learning process and driving their learning on their own. This is one of the most highly recommended teaching approaches in agricultural education, and it's extremely, extremely effective. And ultimately, it creates the opportunity for a student to have a higher internal motivation for their own learning and satisfaction. So the model of this is the student is extremely active as a learner, and they're learning in search of meaning on a content area that you've presented to them, a problem, so to speak. Think of trying to cover a unit in beef nutrition, and where you're trying to get them to think about how could they best get steers to grow more effectively and more quickly. So you're learning through inquiry, encouraging interactions in order to gain information. So now again, as the teacher transforms him or herself from a deliverer of content, a lecturer, so to speak, to now just a facilitator, guiding the learning process, providing advice and information as needed through the process, instead of just delivering splat all the content here at one time. And so you're empowering your students to discover, reflect, and create deeper meaning. That's why this works so well. And so if we take a little bit more information on this experiential learning concept, it goes back to the 60s, where Dewey and Kolb, which are legendary figures in the ag ed space, researched this and found it to be quite effective, and it created a lot more concrete learning experiences for students, and it created opportunity for them to put this in the longer-term memory bank that we talked about in a prior unit. Also, it yielded Kolb's model, which is, if we kind of go around the circle here and use that beef example, is we do maybe a feeding example or feeding experiment or study a feeding experiment, so active experimentation. Then we come to a concrete experience. The students could have observed the two different feeding strategies and which steers gained faster and more effectively. Then they reflect upon what happened, study the things that happened and reflect upon that observation and come to the conclusions, whatever they may be. Connect those to the concepts that are maybe a little bit abstract, but now you have information to connect those conclusions to, and you say, well, now what do I do? What would I do next? And that kind of goes back around, again, back to active experimentation. This is why this works so well in agriculture education in certain ways, because now you're really engaging the student in the learning process over and over. A real key part of experiential learning that I love personally is the reflection piece. And so what you're trying to do here is replay the experience and evaluate the topic. And anytime I put together a reflection piece, students tend to just kind of roll their eyes, think about, I didn't come here to write papers. And that's not the approach that I'm trying to use in my classroom. Whenever I assign a reflection piece, I want you to sit and think about carefully what happened in the assignment or the project or activity. Write what went well, what didn't go well, what you learned, and what you would do different the next time. That doesn't necessarily constitute a full paper most of the time. Not like an English class, and students worry about I'm going to be evaluated on my grammar and proper sentencing and citing sources and things of that nature. That's not what reflection is really all about. Reflection is simply doing those four things that I just covered. So you're framing the concepts and allowing your students to form the conclusions. And not all students are going to come to the same conclusion. And that's part of it. That's the beauty of reflection and using experiential learning that way. And oftentimes the outcomes of this from the student side is the student learns how to learn. This is one of the great things about experiential learning. The student becomes more responsible for their own learning. Their critical thinking skills and analytical skills improve when you talk about experiential learning. That's why it works so incredibly well in ag education. They develop a technical expertise. sometimes they discover learning awareness needs that they didn't know that they needed to improve upon. But oftentimes they're much more confident, motivated, and retain the information much, much better. Again, that's why experiential learning is so effective in Ag Ed. We've alluded to interest approaches prior and talked about how we integrate them. But generally, because we're talking about a number of things and ways in which we have to generate interest, students today have a lot of activities that you're competing with in Ag Ed, whether it's Gen Ed things, athletics and other extracurricular activities, jobs. There's a lot of things in their life you have to compete with. So you've got to keep them interested and integrated into the learning process. So you've got to create a lot of different teaching methods. You've got to do a lot of different things. You've got to use interest approaches because that creates motivation for learning, you hope. So as we step through this, frame the discussion, whether that's a funny story, a quick little video clip that sets it up, a short activity. You might ask questions, maybe a pre-test. One of the things I like to do is analogies occasionally. But you're trying to help the student zero in on the topic and build then that desire to know, the interest in studying the topic long term. Specific teaching methods, again, select these based upon the topic, the student, and the objective that you're trying to accomplish. This is not going to be the same for every teaching unit. Some of you are going to be more comfortable and confident with certain teaching methods than you are others. But you have to reach into the toolbox here and use different tools as they are appropriate. And we can look at brainstorming, and there's a fit for that occasionally. You can look at lecture discussion. There's a fit for that occasionally. Small group discussion. There's a point to that occasionally. Role plays work well. Demonstration is certainly important at times. Case studies is one that I love a lot. I tend to think that they create a more real-life experience in multi-layered concepts. Field trips, sometimes you just got to take students to where those things occur and let them view it. Experimentation, using games like what I do in our ag finance class by using the farming game in order to drive home the fact of the importance of budgeting and balance sheets and cash flow statements. There's a number of different things that can be effective in your teaching if you use different teaching methods. And you have to employ different strategies for good instruction. It's just good practice. But plan carefully ahead of time. And don't be afraid to try something new that you're not comfortable with. And don't be afraid that certain things may fail. I've done that a number of times over the years. I tried something different, and it was a crash and burn. It was terrible. And I had to obviously learn from that and try something different in terms of a teaching activity, and that's normal for instruction. So think about how you reach your population. And again, this is all true whether we're talking about teaching and learning in the junior high classroom, the high school classroom, the college and university classroom, the extension educator, the Farm Bureau manager, the 4-H leader. All of these are all teaching and learning methods, and you can even employ these in group strategies if you're leading a business group in a project. All of these kinds of things can still work in that regard. So all these are relevant to you, no matter of your area of interest. Problem-based learning, again, we kind of talked about the case studies and project-based. So pose relevant questions. Pose relevant and current topics for them. Encourage students to think and test their conclusion, and discourage things that are useless and not connected to best management practice or industry standards. So occasionally you'll have to find out what students know, model things for them, but guide, motivate, and challenge them. Encourage them to collaborate and reflect upon what they're doing. Test their knowledge with peers. Be flexible, adapt to different learning styles, and use rubrics. Rubrics are so critical in setting up a guideline, and I would take this across all of the things that we've talked about. Learners need to know how they're going to be assessed, what's going to create success for them. So make sure and give them an idea of what constitutes a successful outcome. How many points are going to be dedicated to this specific skill set in my scoring. So I like rubrics, and I'm continuing to try and add them to a number of different things. Well, I hope that adds some context to what's on the slides here to Unit 9 and helps you do your homework a lot more effectively. We'll be talking to you again soon. Thanks for tuning in.